Good morning. Welcome to Sunday Seminary. We would like to introduce you to our guest for the Green Seminary series this morning. She is Dr. Laurel Kearns, professor of ecology, society, and religion, Drew Theological School. Dr. Kearns is located in at Drew, the Graduate Division of Religion of Drew University in Madison, New Jersey, where she's taught for, get this, 26 years on sociology of religion and sociology and ecology topics. During this time, she's helped echo justice to become rooted in the core curriculum at Drew and help guide their extensive sustainability practices. This inspired her to co-found the Green Seminary Initiative, and she serves on the board of it, as well as the Yale Forum on Religion and Ecology. She's a woman after my own heart. She has served twice on the American Academy of Religion and Ecology Steering Committee, as well as the AAR Sustainability Committee. Locally, she has worked with the international organization Green Faith since 1995. As the titles indicate, her research is focused on religion, particularly Christian involvement in ecological issues and environmental movements, with particular interest in environmental and food justice and religious activism on global warming, as well as that can be seen in her recent TEDx talk entitled Take a Deep Breath. She has many publications, and now she is co-editing a forthcoming digital resource on religion and nature as part of the Bloomsbury Religion in North America project. And she has contributed chapters to recent volumes such as The Quakers, Creation, Care, and Sustainability, a field guide to the study of religion and ecology, and the Blackwell Companions to Modern Theology and to Religion and Social Justice. Her decades-long involvement in religious environmentalism has roots in the island where she was born, Sanibel, Florida, an island that may not survive rising sea levels. Please join me in welcoming our lecturer for this morning, Dr. Laurel D. Kearns.
Good morning. Should I just take it away now?
Just take it away.
Good. It's I'm too used to being a teacher and seeing all the faces. So this is a little bit different, that I won't see your faces, but I'm really, really thrilled to be with you. And I do so wish it could have been in person, because I've dreamed of coming to Memphis and visiting for quite a long time. I'm going to share my screen here because it will help me to stay focused. And so I just there's the beautiful context that I come from. That's the Arboretum on my campus. And these trees inspired me to how I'm going to help us think about environmental justice and environmental racism today. So I want you just to look at that beautiful picture for a moment and take a deep breath. Now listen to me the next time I take that deep breath. Rabbi Arthur Waskow suggests that actually breathing is a form of prayer. And if you know the Jewish tradition, you don't say the name of God, but you can breathe it, as this points out. And in reading some of his stuff, he is with the Shalom Center, I was really taken by his reminding us that what we breathe in and what the trees breathe out, and what the trees breathe in is what we breathe out. And that God's breath unites all the very forces, creating all worlds into oneness, each breath unique and all unified. I like to call this an interspecies ritual of communion, because without the plants and algae and we would not breathe, and without our breathing, they would not survive. And I want you to reflect on this. I suggest that it says we conspire together, we breathe together, and the state of the planet right now needs us to conspire in more than one way. Just to remind you, last week's talk by Dean Valerie Bridgman was so excellent. And so I had to go back and at least tie in a moment of biblical verse, but just to remind you of this passage in Genesis 2 that tells us that God blew life into the human's nostrils. And that breath is the word ruach. It's the same word that is hovering, God is hovering over the face of the deep in Genesis 1. And Ted Hebert, an excellent biblical scholar, reminds us that air is not regarded as a material element that is empty of divinity. No, it has a divine character. It originates from God. It is God's. It is a medium of the revelation of God and an indication of God's presence. For the biblical theologian, ruach is sacred. And so I ask my students, what would happen if we really took seriously the air as God's breath and air pollution as defiling God's breath? Now, since I know that this series is funded by the Methodist Church, I just have to get in my favorite Wesley quote here. Just if you can't think about God's pervasive presence in terms of the air, Wesley reminds us that God is in all things and that we are to see the Creator in the face of every creature, that we should use and look upon nothing as separate from God. And this is the next line that always strikes me, which indeed is a kind of practical atheism. In other words, to not see God in this world is to not really believe in God. That one certainly makes you pause and think. So when I teach on this, I ask my students, what is the difference between these two? And hopefully you would be one of the ones that said one of them is the view of the planet from space, and the other one is the globe in our classroom. And they have two very different messages, don't they? Because this one shows the interconnectedness, and this one shows the divisions. I like to call this the communal, and this the sort of individualized. And even though these boundaries are artificial in many ways, sometimes they're natural geographic forms, which side of that boundary you live on can be life or death. But sometimes we forget that air pollution and water pollution respects none of these boundaries. And indeed, even if we were to look more deeply into one country, air pollution, water pollution doesn't respect zip codes, doesn't respect class. In other words, our air pollution here in New Jersey comes a lot from the Midwest. But it also is a vision of two different, we might say, visions of justice. And they're not mutually exclusive, but when we use the term eco-justice, we're often think of justice that's sort of right relations for all creatures. But too often when we use the term environmental justice, we just think about people. And that is going to be my topic today, environmental justice. But I want to remind us that all of the environmental justice issues I'm going to talk about take place in this globe, and that all of those issues affect all creatures. God made all of us creatures. And so We need to always keep that in mind. Indeed, the Pope's encyclical Laudato Si reminds us that we have to realize that a true ecological approach always becomes a social approach. It must integrate questions of justice and debates on the environment so as to hear both the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor. One more glimpse of that context. I started us off with breathing. This is the planet, quote, breathing. And all of this is the buildup of greenhouse gases in the winter months in the Northern Hemisphere here when we don't have leaves on the trees to absorb it. And this is when it starts to absorb. Down here, you can see this is now at the end of the summer. And the problem is the planet can't clear its lungs. This is a portrait of global warming. And I want to remind you that what global warming means is for so many that they can't breathe either. So I want you to take another deep breath with me, but this time don't let it out. Keep holding it. Start to feel that pressure on your lungs. Now imagine what it would be like that that's always how it felt to breathe, that you couldn't get enough oxygen. But this isn't just a physical statement, because we know I can't breathe are the haunting, haunting sounds of George Floyd and Eric Garner and so many others that have been, the life has been physically choked out of them. Those are awful, violent issues that we can point to, and they grab our attention, I hope. But what doesn't often grab our attention is that, for instance, in New Jersey, more people die of respiratory problems than gunshot wounds. In other words, more people die of air pollution that we don't even see or think much about. This report from the United Church of Christ really brings it home: breath to the people, sacred air, and toxic pollution. And this is part of their map where they try and show the 100 most polluting facilities and remind us that when over 112,000 children under age 5 in our nation live within 3 miles of these super polluting facilities, and when over 11,000 live within a mile, it is a moral crisis that our nation faces. As people of faith, we are not easily satisfied when the fate of our children and the planet is at stake. So I want to share with you, and I'm going to have to stop and reshare, a powerful poem that brings home environmental justice and environmental racism so well for me. This poem was brought to my attention by a student who had taught this young man then in her high school class. Oh no, it's worked every single time I've played it, but now, well, there's nothing you do in this moment except for stop and go back to your PowerPoint. That's a shame. So what Joshua Bennett ends this powerful poem with is reminding us of how environmentalists look to many people of color and people in urban areas or poor areas. The environmentalists look like they're rich people. So no, my house doesn't have solar panels on the roof, and my parents don't own a hybrid automobile, and I never really considered myself an environmentalist until the day I realized that it is all connected. The neighborhoods that host toxic waste facilities are almost always communities of color. And he ends with, my little brother can't run quite as fast as I could when I was his age, because the smog has its fingers pressed firmly around his windpipe. Until the day we can exhale away this pain, you will hear my voice cascading across the sky, begging Mother Earth to have mercy on her children. It's really a shame I couldn't play that so you could hear his powerful spoken word. So I want us to think about that little brother of his, or in this instance, this little girl in Newark, New Jersey. And I want you just to be with me for a moment in her life. The hospitalization rate for children living in Newark is 150% greater than the rest of the state. And asthma attacks are the leading cause of school absenteeism in the region, and indeed in most urban areas and densely populated. Now, when she walks to school, this is the kind of pollution she's dealing with. This is the biggest incinerator in the state of New Jersey. And these are some of the trucks going through the port of Newark. So she walks to school at tailpipe level of all of those trucks and buses coming through Newark, not just to get to the port, but to transfer garbage, to transfer medical waste. In other words, she lives in an area that is besieged with environmental injustice and environmental racism. Because you can bet that these incinerators were not placed in wealthier and whiter communities. Diesel fumes are far worse for asthma, up to 50 times that of gasoline vehicles. And this is the port of Philadelphia. And I just want to remind you that what these ports represent is our insatiable consumer desires, because so much is being brought in to these ports that then can be trucked across the country as we eagerly order from Amazon and all sorts of things right now in this time of COVID. So maybe she doesn't live next to a highway or a major thoroughfare for trucks, but she lives next to some of these huge animal production plants. And this insight came to me from the Reverend William Barber, who is a Drew graduate, and I hope you are familiar with his powerful, powerful prophetic voice. Because what he reminded me was that in North Carolina, some of the biggest issues of environmental racism are having to live next to pork processing. So these buildings hold 10,000 hogs, and the manure is often, I didn't include a picture, but the manure is spread out over these green fields. And so the feathers from this and the manure in the air from this and the dust from this cattle feedlot, all of those contribute also to people having asthma, not wanting to open the windows, and the children in particular having asthma attacks. Now, I don't know about you if you've been around somebody with asthma, but my son has asthma. And what happens when you can't breathe well at school is you go to the, and here's one more example, maybe a little closer to home to y'all, and this is Mountaintop removal in West Virginia. These children too, these families suffer from incredible environmental injustice from the air particulate matter. And we're going to go back to that in a minute about why that level of fine particulate matter is particularly the problem. But these children, if they arrive at school or at school, have an asthma attack, they're often sent to the nurse. And there they will get medicines that are steroids sometimes, and they make them more hyper and more aggressive. They already are having issues because when you can't breathe well, you're in a panic. And also we know that that kind of long-term breathing issue means that it shapes how a child develops, how active they can be, all sorts of things. But what I want to suggest here is that that little girl, when she comes back to the classroom and she's fidgety in the classroom in Newark and not paying enough attention, often then gets sent to the principal and she gets dismissed. She's seen as disruptive. And it falls into this pattern of minor infractions that make students lose more and more days of school and therefore fall farther and farther behind. And we blame the teachers, we blame the school, we blame the parents, and rarely do we look outside and see what the air quality is that they're breathing. This reminds us of the definition put forward by the environmental justice movement, that the environment is where we live, where we work, and where we play. And I always add, where we learn and where we pray. Because if we don't take seriously the enormous impact of air pollution, which we know how to do something about, and is in some ways an unseen killer, then we are not at all paying attention to justice for all of God's creatures. The United Church of Christ reminds us in these two studies of toxic waste and race, who are the communities that live closest to toxic and hazardous facilities? And they almost always, an overwhelming correlation, are people of color and people of lower socioeconomic status. The Reverend Dr. James Cone, the great Black liberation theologian, reminds us of what is behind this pattern that we have just seen. And that is the logic that led to slavery and segregation in the Americas, colonization and apartheid in Africa, and the rule of white supremacy throughout the world is the same logic that leads to the exploitation of animals and the ravaging of nature. The fight for justice cannot be segregated, but must be integrated with the fight for life in all its forms. And that is what brings us to our topic today: environmental justice, environmental injustice, and environmental racism. Now, this is another wonderful Black liberation theologian, an eco-womanist, Melanie Harris. And she reminds us that African Americans' environmental experiences are unique because the movement of the beauty of nature found in Black people's deep awareness and connection with the calming rhythms of the earth is simultaneously marked by the horrors, the lynching of Black bodies, the realities of rape and oppression of Black enslaved women and men, and the domination and cruelty of white racism. So what I want to suggest with this is that we recognize that the long history of racism, of white supremacy, and of injustice feeds into these patterns of environmental injustice that we see now. Indeed, we should be reminded of the many ways that the experience of toxic environments, in more ways than one, have shaped the attitudes of African Americans, not just African Americans, this would be true of Latinx, that then make environmentalist seem not somebody who understands what they're going through, but somebody that still represents that white supremacy. This is changing, thankfully, but it's been a long time. The first People of Color Summit Environmental Summit was in 1992. Alonda Clay, who is now at MTSO with Dean Bridgman, also helps us to think about this, that all too often we use the term environmental racism as a proxy for race, and then focuses on sort of the negative narratives of slavery, of sharecropping, and environmental degradation as the totality by which African Americans experience nature. And that's why that quote by Melanie Harris actually should be following this. More recently, Alonda Clay has also asked, why do we call all of these instances environmental racism? But we don't call the fact that majority of white suburbs who have fought hard to make sure that none of those polluting facilities in their backyards, isn't that a form of environmental racism also, of shifting all of the problems to someone of a different race and ethnicity or class? What James Cone and Melanie Harris and many theologians would remind us is that what undergirds this is a sort of hierarchy of value that we can see present in many forms of Christian theology. And we particularly, I would say, see it really virulent today. And that is that God is the most valued, and that those who are closest to God are men or those who are part of the dominant group who are white. And that other humans get divided by race, gender, class, age, and seen as less valuable. And boy, is this striking in the language that I hear about COVID and, oh, those old people are going to die anyway. Why should they get vaccines first? Or think about who gets called animal names in terrible ways, showing us that the way to degrade humans is in some ways to say that they are less than. So this is a much longer thing, but this hierarchy of values in which the closer you are viewed to nature, the less valuable you are, undergirds so many of our problems here globally, especially embedded in some forms of Christian theologies. Certainly not all. I've just introduced you to some amazing theologians. And I wanted to put up these book titles to remind you of these many facets of environmental racism. Because it's also, who do we expect to see in the outdoors? Who do we think loves nature or wants to hike? And how are people of color, when they do hike, treated? There's some pretty horrific stories of longtime true hikers on the Appalachian Trail who are Black and the kind of experiences they get. Dorceta Taylor reminds us of how racism and white privilege have been baked into the rise of the conservation movement, and also reminds us of sort of the ways, the patterns of residential settlement where industrial sites are that we've already talked about. But I don't want to act like, well, I'll go with how my slides are. Let's see. I want to give you a sense of a larger view of just environmental injustice and environmental racism through this really powerful poem.
Dear Mata Filipino, you are a 7-month-old sunrise of gummy smiles. You are bald as an egg and bald as the Buddha. Your thighs that are thunder, shrieks that are lightning, so excited for bananas, hugs, and our morning walks along the lagoon. Dear Mata Filipino, I want to tell you about that lagoon, that lucid, sleepy lagoon lounging against the sunrise. Men say that one day, that lagoon will devour you. They say it will gnaw at the shoreline, chew at the roots of your breadfruit trees, gulp down rows of your seawalls, and crunch through your island's shattered bones. They say you, your daughter, and your granddaughter too, will wander rootless, with only a passport to call home. Dear Mata Filipino, don't cry. Mommy promises you, no one will come and devour you. No greedy whale of a company sharking through political seas, no backwater bullying of businesses with broken morals, no blindfolded bureaucracies gonna push this mother ocean over the edge. No one's drowning, baby. No one's moving. No one's losing their homeland. No one's gonna become a climate change refugee. Or should I say, no one else. To the Carteret Islanders of Papua New Guinea and to the Taro Islanders of Fiji, I take this moment to apologize to you. We are drawing the line here because, baby, we are going to fight. Your mommy, daddy, boo-boo, dimma, your country, and your president too, we will all fight. And even though there are those hidden behind platinum titles who like to pretend that we don't exist, that the Marshall Islands, Tuvalu, Kiribati, Maldives, and Typhoon Haiyan in the Philippines, and floods of Pakistan, Algeria, and Colombia, and hurricanes, tidal waves, and earthquakes didn't exist, still, there are those who see us. Hands reaching out, fists raising up, banners unfurling, megaphones booming, and we are canoes blocking coal ships. We are the radiance of solar villages. We are the rich, clean soil of the farmer's past. We are petitions blooming from teenage fingertips. We are families biking, recycling, reusing, engineers dreaming, designing, building, artists painting, dancing, writing. We are spreading the word. And there are thousands out on the street, marching with signs, hand in hand, chanting for change now. They're marching for you, baby. They're marching for us. Because we deserve to do more than just survive. We deserve to thrive. Dear Mata Filipino, you are eyes heavy with drowsy weight. So just close those eyes, baby, and sleep in peace. Because we won't let you down. You'll see.
That powerful opening to the 2014 climate accords speaks so much of the huge dimensions of environmental injustice that come with climate change. Because not only are the greenhouse gases and the pollution that create global warming part of the problem, it's the rising seas. And so I just wanted to make sure that even with my focus on air, that I remind you of the focus on water. I also wanted you to see the faces across the globe of those who are facing the consequences of climate injustice, who will become refugees. Island cultures that have existed far longer than Christianity, who will cease to exist in terms of having land. Those are also the dimensions of environmental justice and environmental racism. So just to reemphasize that point, that I may have been focusing a lot on environmental injustice in relation to the area where I live and the people, the brown and black communities that particularly pay the price. But I don't want to forget the water crises that are also often afflicting those communities the most. And also then the incredible issues of environmental racism and injustice that are affecting Native, indigenous communities across the globe. But here in the United States, the connection between pipelines for fossil fuels, for gas, for oil, the way that coal is transported, and the issues of water, that water is life, and how those impact indigenous peoples and the sovereignty on their lands. I'm going to just quickly go here. This is sort of a reminder of what climate injustice will look like in my area. Those are the areas that they predict by 2050 will be underwater. So I ask for a moment of silence. Now, out of silence can come hope. But I think we've really got to reckon with how silent faith communities have been. And thankfully, that is really, really changing. You have so many options out there of ways to begin to work on this. But I want a moment of silence also for all of those who have been silenced, have not been heard. And for all those whose lives have been and will be lost because of air pollution, because of COVID, because of rising seas and climate disruptions. And then a reminder that this silence represents not just the silencing of human voices, but of the voices of all creation. Because when a species goes extinct, and we're under a period of rapid species extinction, it's an extinguishing of the member of the choir, the praise choir for God that the Psalms tell us about. So I'm going to stop there. I have a lot more, But I want to just make sure there's time for some questions, and then we'll see if I have time to keep going. How are we doing? Nathan, Diane?
Right now, we don't have any questions in the question and answer portal, but I have a question uh, and a comment that I'd like to make, Dr. Kearns. Having been in, I grew up in the Mississippi Delta, and I grew up on a farm. And one of my dad for 54 years worked on a farm. And what happened was that we saw a lot of cases of cancer, so many different types of cancer with the tractor drivers who were driving the tractors as they were spraying the crops. You know, those Venturi spreaders were, you know, they knew no boundaries, and so a lot of times people were exposed to that. And of course, they eventually died from all these weird cancers that were never connected back to that farming area. And so that was so sad to me. And of course, we had one cluster of leukemia in the Delta too. And that was due to people living at the edges of those croplands.
And I'm really glad you made that connection, because whereas I talked about the sort of results of animal farm production, the kind of chemicals that we are spraying now, and exactly that the workers, the farmers are exposed to incredible, incredible issues of cancer and other illnesses related to that. And it also, it's the poisoning of all creation in the process. And I think we need, I know I'm thrilled you've got 2 weeks coming up on food justice, because this is heart and center of the issue. Some of the issues of food justice is what happens to those who are subjected to the sprays of all these chemicals, whether they're fertilizers, herbicides, insecticides. So thank you for bringing that up. Well, I think since we don't have too many questions, I see
We
one
have another question, Dr. Kearns.
from Mary Volmer.
Yes.
And
Yes.
I'm gonna get to that. So I'm glad it's there, because partly what I'm trying to do already is to say, you all may be in context where you can't talk as directly about climate change, for instance, or even feel like you can't talk about racism as much, though Lord knows you need to. But if you start talking about God's breath and the defilement of it, it does change the conversation. And so I'm going to give you a little, I'm a sociologist, so I'm going to give you a little more data here about connecting it in with COVID right now. But then I'm going to speed through some of my slides so that I can give you a little more sense of maybe ways to frame that. Because other than peaceful protest, right now, many of us have engaged in some of the most important thing, and that is to vote. But I want to remind people that it's your local officials, it's your state officials, your county officials that have a huge, huge impact on where things get placed, on enforcing environmental regulations, on helping people have access to healthcare. So we often get focused when we talk about voting on presidential elections, and Lord knows this was an important one because we saw the rollback of 95 different environmental regulations just about clean air standards. So there is a tremendous amount of work to even regain where we had been in trying to ensure cleaner water and cleaner air for people. So let me go back to my slideshow, if y'all don't mind, and give you a little bit more, because what I'm really concerned is that you all help people understand that it does make a difference what kind of car you drive, what kind of electricity you use, how much you consume, how the trash is disposed of, how much we waste. All of those are part of this picture of environmental justice and environmental racism. And we have tremendous resources within Christianity to work on it. So one of the things I often do is ask people, do you want to breathe some dirty air? I have never heard anyone say yes. This is a picture of Seoul, Korea, and these are some of our Korean students who were, while they were there, had to wear masks the whole time, and one of them even ended up hospitalized. And for Korea, young people are often told, don't have children unless you can move somewhere else, because the air pollution is getting so bad, and the air pollution is coming from China in part and coming from other places. So I use this to remind people of how dirty air, of air pollution, is connected globally to some of the ways that our economic system works. And that is that we like to buy the cheapest products. And that means that they are usually produced somewhere where the environmental regulations are far, far less. So here's a couple of books that really bring this point home. And I just want you to see this number of early deaths. Think of the efforts, the amount that's spent on convincing us to eat something differently, to take a supplement, to do something so that we don't die as soon. And yet, 9 out of 10 people around the world now breathe air containing high levels of pollutants. So I ask, what does it mean to love your neighbor as yourself if the vast majority of people around the globe cannot breathe well enough to thrive? These are pretty staggering statistics. Here's another one. I'm just going to go through some of this a little bit faster. This is Robert Bullard, who is sort of the father of sociological environmental justice studies, just reminding us of who is more likely to have asthma and who is more likely to die from it. But then bringing that into COVID. So what we know with COVID is if you already have scarred lungs from breathing fine particulate matter, you are more susceptible and less able to fight it off. That same bad air pollution is tied to a variety of health disparities, whether it's diabetes or hypertension or kidney disease. And so, as we know, those are comorbidities that have shaped why African Americans, people of color, Native Americans are far more likely to die of COVID. Here's a little bit more on that, but I'm not going to spend as much time on it. There's lots in the New York Times on this, just to drive home that absolutely disparate rate of death of COVID is not equal opportunity. It really affects those who already have respiratory issues. So, how can we talk about climate and air pollution in a way in our churches? And so I just wanted to give you 2 examples, one from the AME church, to make sure we think of public health as a moral issue. And then this one is from the What Would Jesus Drive campaign, long time ago now. Anyone remember WWJD? I certainly used to see when I lived in Atlanta, plenty of billboards. And that is, how can one follow Jesus' commandment to love your neighbor as yourself if the car you drive, the electricity you use contributes to asthma? The point I just made earlier. And here was a powerful effort by an organization called Green the Church. They're having some excellent lectures coming up in the next week. And that is that as leaders in the Black church, we view climate change as a moral issue and one of the greatest public health challenges. So you see how I started us out thinking about air as God's breath that animates the whole world, got us to think about what would it mean if we recognized air pollution as a defilement of God's breath, then reminded us of Jesus' commandment to love our neighbor as ourselves, and brought the question back, so what does it mean to love your neighbor, to recognize that God's breath animates the whole world and still do nothing about air pollution and its health impacts? This is a more recent statement from the Evangelical Environmental Network, and I chose their work, one, because I've worked with them for a long, long time. I'm a former evangelical. I'm now a Quaker, but also just to listen to how they phrase it. Every child born and yet to be born deserves the promise and holy covenant of clean air and a healthy climate. So I ask you, do you put aside money for your children, your grandchildren, your nieces, your nephews? Do you spend any time thinking about what is it that you will leave to the next generation? Most of us spend part of our lives wanting to pass on something, whether it's monetary or it's even the legacy of our actions. So children around the globe are asking us, what are we doing? Because their future is in our hands. Frontline communities across the globe are asking us, what are we doing? Because their communities and lives are in our hands. Now, one of the things we have to do is to really resist climate denial, because I love how this phrases it. What if it's a big hoax and we create a better world for nothing? Shouldn't that be what we're focused on? A cleaner, healthier planet for everybody? Just one last reminder, that little fragile blue marble in space, as it was called by the astronauts in the 60s, that is our home. What does it mean to be charged in those Genesis passages with being caretakers of our home? And now I'm back. Any other questions or comments from people?
Mary Bomer, you addressed a part of her question. Was her question answered adequately, or does she have something else she wants to say? I don't know. Her question is, other than peaceful protests, what are your suggestions for us to do our part to correct this assault on God's creation? So,
and I think what I hope I've been showing is that it's partially what we do at the individual level. All actions add up to something greater. It's the sort of problem of the commons. And we all too often think our individual actions don't make a difference. And it's sort of, I illustrated to my students, as if I walked across our quad, the grass wouldn't suffer. And if 5 of my students followed me, it wouldn't. But if we walked back and forth across that path 10 times, eventually the grass is going to die. Which one of us killed the grass? Was it me because I was the first one? Was it the last person? It was all of us. So even though individual actions aren't enough, and we get lots of messaging suggesting that we do something individually and not look at what corporate actors or government actors also can do, individual actions still make a difference. And you're going to spend the next 2 weeks talking about some of the ways I suspect that food plays a role, but I'll lean into that right now to say one of the things that we're seeing, and it's not the only thing, is that if we change the way we eat and move away from eating as much meat, we eat way, way more meat here in the United States than we need or than most people have access to globally. But it's people in other places, and it's places like the Amazon and all of those portraits I showed you of industrial meat production that have a large, large impact on climate emissions and on the destruction of forests and trees. So that's one place. And it's not that people are asking that you go, vegan. I love the Pentecostal preacher, though vegan is certainly the, the best way. But I love the Pentecostal preacher who told me he just wanted to move meat from the starring role on the plate to the supporting actor role. And if you think about it, just so many cuisines grew up with meat being the treat. And so you used just a little of it and you didn't always have it available. But as I said again, helping your congregations think about this, helping them think about it as a commandment. In some ways, the first commandment before the 10 Commandments was to till and care for the earth. And I imagine some of you are thinking, no, it was the dominion passage, that one in Genesis 1. And I just want to suggest that if we look at the kings in the Hebrew scriptures and how they were held accountable for their dominion, that might change the way we think of dominion, meaning humans have the right to do anything we want. I don't think our interpretation of dominion, our contemporary one, is at all the same. But I do just want to remind you of the prophets constantly calling the kings of Israel into account for how woefully they were serving God.
Okay, we have a comment. Thank you. I especially appreciated the observation of the earth from space compared to a globe, interconnectedness versus divisions.
I'll tell you, the way that works best is you have 2 blow up beach balls that you come into the classroom with or into the space with. And there's this image of me that the United Methodist News Service put out a long time ago of me holding one of these big beach balls giving a talk. But yeah, just you can do so much with just working with those 2 images and what they convey and the difference in the realities and the connection. So if you can't get beach balls in this world right now, we only can show each other images. I encourage you to use those 2 images and then to think about the biblical text in relation to them. Anyone else?
Okay. How do you respond to those who argue that the sooner earth is destroyed, the sooner Christ will come?
Well, first of all, I suggest they read Revelation, because that's not at all what it says. It says that the kingdom will come down to this earth. And so I think there's incredible misinterpretation of this. The reason I'm not an evangelical anymore was because of exactly this kind of thinking. I don't think it's as widespread as we think. In other words, I worked with a data set that thankfully was big enough to really be able to tease out like Hispanic Catholics and Black Protestants. And one of the interesting things is when I looked at the measures on belief in the end times, which is part of what you're saying, the Black Protestants and Hispanic Catholics had almost the same degree of belief in end times as white evangelicals, but they were the 2 groups most likely to be concerned about climate change. And so there's so many good theologians that remind us. I love the sort of the rabbis that remind us that even if the Messiah was coming tomorrow, you still would plant a tree. Because we do not know when the Messiah will come. So I hope that helps you a little bit. There's some really good, and I would probably recommend Chris Doran's book. He's an evangelical out at oh, it's not Pepperdine. It's anyway, it's out on the West Coast. But if you write me, I'm glad to give you resources on how to work with more conservative Christians on that point. And also just suggest, look at the Evangelical Environmental Network's work on that, or Catherine Hayhoe, an evangelical climate scientist.
Okay.
I love there's someone in Minnesota that joined. That's great.
Becky Coleman, yes. She wants to thank you for this presentation.
Well, I'm just grateful for the opportunity by far. So does anyone want to indulge me and I see if I can play that last poem that I wanted so much to play?
We have about 4 minutes, so.
Let me give it a try one more time.
Okay.
Let's see.
Have someone from Spokane, Washington. Welcome.
No, not very good at dealing with all my open things. So let's just see. It's hard to find because he did it when he was young, and this blog is actually from a student of mine. Here we go.
I grew up believing that water should be the color of corpses, that air should taste like a gumbo of gunpowder and weak old garbage cans, that children should have mouths like landfills and learn to speak hatred before they ever know what it means to love language across this country, on the wrong side of the poverty line, where the bodies are too dark for television cameras. Environmental racism is little more than yet another set of unfamiliar syllables rich people use to describe the way it's always been for us. See, the sun made us ultraviolet, but the hood made us ultraviolet in a place where neighborhood residents become nuclear reactors who transform street corners into Chernobyl disasters based on each other's actions. We are dying to explode into one another. Hazardous material has transformed Harlem into Hiroshima. There are pregnant mothers with mushroom clouds inside their wombs glowing like a shard of uranium the second before the atom splits. And I'm scared to raise my children in a neighborhood where people look like them. Toxic wastelands where dirty water leads to infected minds. So we throw up gang signs just to purge our insides, release heat to breathe easy, and never know the difference between what we were owed and what we learned to live with. And you would figure that after Birmingham and Tulsa, we will be used to burning by now. So we sit, brown bodies black into a crisp, on the back blocks of blacktop jungles where crack is king and dreams crumble like glaciers melting half a world away that these children will never see or read about during summer school, where unair-conditioned classrooms grow too hot for knowledge to pass from lips to ears. Truth melts in the air slow and thick like the weed smoke we inhale just to forget what it feels like to always live life in extremes. Those moments where global warming becomes more than a buzzword, more like a reminder that the flashy cell phones we throw away every day may soon resurrect themselves as the most ironic reminders that we just want the world to hear us. Black lungs, so accustomed to not breathing, whether from drowning in transatlantic trade waters or hanging in the space between environmental legislation and corporate interest. We become non-recyclable refuse, the blackened ashes of America's past. Of a neglectful nation that simply cannot see that the month-old meat on grocery store shelves is the only thing around here going green. So no, my house doesn't have solar panels on the roof. My parents don't own a hybrid automobile, and I never considered myself an environmentalist until the day I realized that it is all connected. That the neighborhoods chosen to host toxic waste facilities are almost always communities of color. That there are chemicals in the water that make our little girls look grown before they're old enough to deal with the consequences. That my little brother can't run quite as fast as I could when I was his age because the smog has his fingers pressed firmly around his windpipe. So until the day that we can exhale away this pain, you will hear my voice cascading across the sky, unmistakable as the sound of a crashing pesticide plane, begging Mother Earth to have mercy on her children.
All right. We're out of time. Thank you, Dr. Kearns. This has been quite enlightening and just refreshing to just take in new knowledge this morning. And we want to thank our audience, those of you who joined us for this Green Seminary initiative as a part of the MTS Sunday Morning Seminary series, God's Call to Creation Care and Environmental Justice. We do have 2 more weeks of this, and Nathan will be posting a link for our next Sunday's lecture. So be sure to go in and register. And of course, Dr. Kearns, your lecture will be posted on our website. So those of us who want to just revisit this over and over again will be able to have access to it. It has been a pleasure. Thank you so very much.
It's been my pleasure to be with all of y'all. And just a reminder, lkearns@drew.edu. I love to help people in whatever way I can. This is my calling, my vocation, my ministry. So help me help you. Okay? Take care. Bye.
Thank you.